Countless strategies and decks found competitive success at some point in Magic's history in its various formats, using cards that would give the typical Magic player pause. In some cases, it's a card that's aged quite poorly out of its former niche, while sometimes a new card will catapult a formerly awful card into relevance. While this is a topic we've discussed in a previous video, there's enough material to warrant a second look through 10 of the worst cards to ever see competitive success in Magic the Gathering. And at number 10, we have Woodweaver's Puzzleknot. This artifact costs 2 generic mana and gains you 3 life and 3 energy counters when it enters. You may pay 2 generic and 1 green mana and sacrifice Woodweaver's Puzzleknot to gain another 3 life and 3 energy. Energy counters were first introduced in the Kaladesh block and represent an alternate resource to mana that some cards require as an additional cost for some effects and abilities. Woodweaver's Puzzleknot is one of the quicker ways to stockpile energy in the early game. There are other spells that produce energy at similar, if not more efficient rates, like a Galvanic Discharge, but those spells often quickly spend that very same energy for their effect. This itself is fine, but limits opportunities to build up your energy reserves as you're constantly paying the energy you just gained. Of course, in competitive play, you generally don't care about stockpiling energy, since most energy cards tend to generate enough energy to function, even when it was legal in Standard. As such, a card that just gains you a bunch of life and energy is far from impressive in a competitive setting. Aetherworks Marvel is the glaring exception to this, as a card that shines when you're able to make a lot of energy quickly. This legendary artifact has an ability to tap itself and pay 6 energy to look at the top 6 cards of your library and cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. As just a 4 mana artifact, Marvel can activate very early in the game, assuming it has the energy to spend. Aetherworks Marvel does have a second ability that nets you an energy whenever a permanent you control is put into the graveyard to help pay this cost. But Woodweaver Puzzleknot will gain you enough to use Marvel once all on its own. From there, you can cast a free Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger and take over the game with its cast trigger and imposing body. This deck was potent enough that Aetherworks Marvel was banned outright in Standard during its time in the format, which left Puzzleknot without a real proper home. Today, Aetherworks Marvel is a fringe strategy in the modern format, but the energy support that came with Modern Horizons 3 has given Woodweaver's Puzzleknot a newfound splash of playability in the modern day. It mainly earns a spot on this list for its time at Standard, or Aetherworks Marvel decks were one of the best strategies in the format at the time, given their explosive potential. As long as Aetherworks Marvel exists, there will at least be some demand for efficient methods to make for quick energy production, specifically to turn it on. And for the time being, Woodweaver's Puzzleknot remains one of the more efficient options on that front. And at number 9, we have Ovalchase Daredevil. This human pilot costs 3 generic and 1 black mana, and has 4 power and 2 toughness. Whenever an artifact enters under your control, you may return Ovalchase Daredevil from graveyard to the hand. The Daredevil's high power allows it to pressure damage and force trades, while its ability will bring it back once it eventually does trade. This works well enough in limited formats, however, a mana value of 4 makes it a real tough ask to play this card conventionally in a competitive deck. It's maybe no surprise then that the card only started seeing any form of reasonable play once a strategy came around that never really wanted to cast the card. This came when Modern Horizons 2 introduced Azmarano Mardica Daystina Koldakar, a legendary human wizard with no mana innate mana cost that cost 1 hybrid black-red mana if you've discarded a card this turn. When she enters, you may search your library for the Underworld Cookbook, reveal it, and put it into your hand. She also allows you to sacrifice 2 foods to make target creature deal 6 damage to itself. The synergy with Ovalchase Daredevil comes into play when looking at the Underworld Cookbook, which you can tap to discard a card and create a food token. You may also pay 4 mana, tap, and sacrifice the Underworld Cookbook to return a creature card from graveyard to hand. The chef and her cookbook make for a value engine that stockpiles food tokens that can then be used as spot removal in a pinch. This engine requires cards to discard, however, which generally makes it inefficient in long games. Ovalchase Daredevil offsets this by serving as discard fodder. You pitch it to the cookbook and make a food token, which counts as an artifact entering the battlefield under your control. This puts the Daredevil back in your hand and sets you up for your next discard. This allows you to make multiple food tokens in one turn cycle if you have more than one cookbook. While the food-based synergy can be used in a variety of cores and strategies, it's far from the most popular in the modern metagame, given its relative slowness and sometimes clunky draws. That said, this fringe successful modern deck is still infinitely more playable than Ovalchase Daredevil once saw. It went from a reasonable draft pick to a key piece of a value engine over the course of a couple of new cards being printed, which is better than most cards could ever hope for. And at number 8, we have Lantern of Insight. This artifact costs 1 generic mana. It makes each player play with the top card of their library revealed. You may tap and sacrifice Lantern to make target players shuffle their library. Card information is generally a powerful thing to have access to in Magic the Gathering, although it's generally not strong enough to run a card that solely provides that. You could cast something like Thoughtseize that tells you every card in your opponent's hand and lets you take one away from it. In comparison, only seeing the top card of the deck is less powerful, especially when your opponent gets the same advantage. It's only once you combine this with other cheap artifacts that the card goes from unassuming to unbearable. Ghoulcaller's Bell and other similar artifacts cost just 1 mana and can be tapped to remove the top card of either or both players' libraries. Bell mills it, whereas Pixis of Pandemonium exiles the card in question. This forms the backbone of a deck called Lantern Control, where you use these mill rocks to get rid of any good draw from the top of your opponent's deck. It's a far cry from the classic style of control that aims to answer threats with removal and counter magic. You instead prevent your opponent from ever finding these threats by locking them into drawing only the worst cards for their current situation. While the deck is far from perfect, it has tools like Whir of Invention that provide the deck both redundancy and flexibility. Almost all of the deck's key cards can be found via Urza's Saga, and it attacks on an axis most Magic players won't be prepared for. Lantern of Insight ensures your opponent's sideboard cards are rarely relevant unless they mulligan aggressively for them, and tips you off to whether they do sneak one into their hand. But it is rare that they'll sneak any good draws past a Lantern control deck once it has enough of its pieces on the board. Cards like Ensnaring Bridge lock down your opponent further, making it impossible for them to even attack while you mill rocks to ensure they never draw an answer to the bridge. Many Lantern decks don't even play a conventional win condition like Gear or Ether Grid, simply because it's more optimal to make your opponent scoop to the deck instead. Lantern has fallen to the fringes of the format as a strategy, partly due to losing its fast mana in the form of Mox Opal, yet still remains a tricky option that many swear by, built off the back of many strange cards that could realistically earn a spot on this list. And number 7 goes to Release the Ants. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 red mana and deals 1 damage to any target. Then you clash with an opponent. To clash, each clashing player reveals the top card of the library, then puts the card on top or bottom of the library. The player who revealed the higher mana value card wins the clash. If you win the clash for Release the Ants, you put the spell into your hand. Clash itself is a fairly lackluster mechanic considering how inconsistent it is. Even if you build your deck with tons of high mana value spells, you could always hit a land and basically lose the clash by default. In the case of Release the Ants, 1 damage is far from impressive, especially if you just lose the clash and the spell hits the graveyard. Unsurprisingly, the card doesn't see any play for fair purposes, and instead serves as an optional win condition for Omnitail decks. These decks aim to use their namesake card to play Omniscience as early as possible via a show and tell. Omniscience is a very expensive enchantment that lets you cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. This extremely powerful effect makes some cards far stronger than they otherwise would be, considering there's basically no investment for them. With Omniscience out, as long as you stack a high mana value card to the top of your deck to guarantee winning your clashes, you can cast Release the Ants infinitely to ping your opponent to death. And the deck already plays a high density of game-ending creatures like a Grizzlebrand to cheat out with Omniscience or Show and Tell. So it's simply a matter of using something like Brainstorm to put one of those on top of the deck. You don't even need to run Release the Ants in your main deck and risk drawing it in the early game, thanks to Wish, which can just grab it from your sideboard. Release the Ants is an extremely unimpressive card that only has competitive value when all of your spells are free to cast. And even then, it's still bad enough you'd only want it in your sideboard despite it being a win condition, which says a lot about how good it is outside of literally winning you the game thanks to a convoluted synergy. And at number 6, we have Wizard School. This land can be tapped to add a colorless mana, and you may pay 1 generic mana and tap it to add 1 blue mana, or pay 2 generic mana to add a white or black mana. Filtering mana from one color to another has existed for ages, with Wizard School from Homelands serving as one of its earliest incarnations. The rate is not so great, At best, you'll be mana neutral with blue mana and actively lose mana when filtering into white or black. Of course, at the time, there was not a wealth of options for color fixing. Today, we take for granted fetch lands that can search up our missing colors, and struggle to recall a time before the likes of Cultivate dominated commander tables. There would just be games where you failed to draw the exact colors you needed. While standard decks did have a Dark Heart Waste and the like in this early era of the game, there was still no guaranteed you'd draw what you were looking for, especially given the game lacked a modern mulligan system. As such, a bit of color fixing, even if inefficient, could sometimes prove vital. This was the thought process that led to Wizard School's inclusion in the winning control deck list of Pro Tour New York 1996. Even then, there was only one copy of the card in the deck, signaling how it was far from an ideal draw in most circumstances. However, it was still useful in a pinch, and its default mode of tapping for colorless could always funnel into the deck's 15 artifacts. Wizard School has some of the least modern potential of any cards in this list, yet has won an event some of these cards may never hope to, if even at only a single copy. As such, it's hard to say just how good Wizard School was for its deck, but we can all agree it certainly is not good now. And at number 5, we have Striped Riverwinder. This serpent costs 6 generic and 1 blue mana, and has 5 power and toughness. It has the keyword hexproof, meaning it cannot be the target of spells or abilities your opponent controls. It also has cycling cost of just 1 blue mana. To cycle a card, you discard the card and then draw a card, essentially opting to replace this card for a chance at drawing something better. Striped Riverwinder is a fairly lackluster card beyond being a creature with cycling. Its mana value is too high to reasonably cast in a timely manner, and even if you did, it would be generally outclassed by other potential threats. The best thing it has going for it is putting itself into the graveyard rather easily, which is what makes this card exploitable in Living End decks. Living End is a powerful sorcery that has no proper mana costs, instead designed to be cast via the suspend mechanic. But since its mana value is technically 0, that means you can use the ability Cascade to prevent this. Spells with Cascade exile cards from the top of your library when you cast them until you exile a non-land card that costs less than it. Then you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Living End decks play the cheapest possible Cascade spells, such as the 3 mana Shardless Agent, and construct their deck so the only card with a lesser mana value than 3 is the namesake Living End. Essentially, every Cascade spell you cast in these decks casts you a free Living End, which is where our friend Striped Riverwinder comes in. Living End makes all players exile all creatures from their graveyards, then sacrifice all creatures they control. After that, every creature exiled with Living End is put onto the battlefield under their owner's control. So, Living End wipes the board and replaces it with every creature that was originally in the graveyard at the time of resolution. This is why Living End decks run a high density of high mana value cycling creatures. In those early turns, when wanting to resolve a Cascade spell, you can filter your hand with cyclers to set up your graveyard and draw into the cards you needed most. In this regard, any cycler with an efficient cycling cost is worth some consideration in a Living End deck. Over the years, these decks have replaced their worst cyclers with new options, aiming to be as efficient and lethal as possible within the shallow card pool of cycling creatures to bring back from the graveyard. Architects of Will or other cyclers like it could arguably take this spot instead since they've fallen out of favor, but given the general flexibility of this role, we instead decided to give the honor to one of the weaker cyclers still seeing play. These days, the likes of Troll of Khazad-dûm have greatly expanded the potency of cycling threats. But even then, on their own, these are still far from impressive cards when played on rate. It's only thanks to more intricate and powerful cards that these mopey cyclers have found a home at all, both in the competitive metagame and a spot on this list. And at number 4, we have Spectral Bears. This bear spirit costs 1 generic and 1 green mana, and has 3 power and toughness. Whenever Spectral Bear attacks, if the defending player controls no black non-token permanents, Spectral Bears won't untap during the next untap step. This is a 2 mana 3/3 with a rather painful downside of leaving it tapped and out of combat every other turn cycle, unless your opponent happens to be on black. This card is completely unplayable by modern standards, and was power crept entirely by Watchwolf years ago. It's important to remember that creatures were not very efficient in the early days of Magic. One of the best creatures in the game, Sarah Angel, only had 4 power and toughness, and while it would beat Watchwolf, it also came down much later in the game. Watchwolf offered sizable damage on a body for a rate that at the time was hard to match. Even if the opponent didn't play black, it was generally worth playing Spectral Bears in your aggressive green decks, because even only getting in attacks every other turn would still be a lot of damage by that era standards. That's to say nothing of the fact that black was immensely popular at this time in the game, thanks to the prominence of necropotence decks. While the meta wasn't entirely centralized around black decks, mono black was one of the main threats one could expect to face, and as such, Spectral Bears often didn't even have a downside. Spectral Bears, unsurprisingly, fell quite substantially as more and more creatures with a similar stat line were printed. And now we have the likes of Werewolf Pack Leader, who has the same mana value and stats, but also can draw you cards, and can be pumped to higher stats and gain the keyword Trample if you pay enough mana in the late game. Creatures have gotten far more powerful over the years, to a point where simply providing damage isn't enough on its own. The disparity in power between creatures of today and the past is so severe that most modern Magic players couldn't even fathom a situation where they'd want to run a card like Spectral Bears. Yet, there was indeed a time where it was among one of the best options for a green deck to be playing. That time has, of course, long since passed, and Spectral Bears remains little more than a comparison point to other, newer cards that do everything it did, but so much better. And in a similar vein, we have Phyrexian War Beast at number 3. This Phyrexian Beast costs 3 generic mana and has 3 power and 4 toughness. When it leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice a land and it deals 1 damage to you. It and Spectral Bears have very similar niches, yet both highlight different branching off points for future design. Spectral Bears showed that green always had access to superior stats. It just got them with less caveats over the years. And Phyrexian War Beast helps track a similar evolution for artifacts. Its rather miserable downside was offset by being an impressive stat line for its mana value. Instead of tempering you for aggression against most decks, it would punish you for letting it die, setting you back even further by taking a land with it when it leaves. This downside is far less restrictive on the aggro playstyle, since Phyrexian War Beast will be able to attack freely and frequently, and by the time it does eventually die, the aggro player could have drawn into enough lands that they don't even mind having to sacrifice one. Phyrexian War Beast, notably, is also colorless, meaning that any deck could run it without consideration for their mana base. This was especially helpful in the early days of Magic with bad fixing. White decks made some of the most effective use of the card, running it alongside Savannah Lions and other cheap aggressive creatures in what was the first true white weenie deck. Phyrexian War Beast even managed to wind up as a 2-of in a World Championship winning list, as one of these weenie builds won Worlds in 1996 in Seattle. These days, we've seen the likes of Smothering Copter prove that even generically costed artifact threats will continue to be pushed into new heights. While it's not hard to surpass Phyrexian War Beasts, it's still remarkable to be able to trace the lineage of these generically good threats to a card that's so innocuous by our standards today. And at number 2, we have Merfolk of the Pearl Trident. This Merfolk costs 1 blue mana, has 1 power and toughness, and a lot of blank space on the card for flavor text. As one of the most mechanically simple cards on this list, with literally nothing going on but a combined stat total of 2, it's maybe a surprise to see this had any competitive use at all. Other bad creatures at the very least had strong stats for the time, whereas this is, by definition, almost the minimum stats of a creature. As its name implies, the creature is unsurprisingly a Merfolk. Even in the early 2000s, this creature type had a decent bit of synergy, tied together by the still powerful Lord of Atlantis that buffs all your other Merfolk. This helps set the template for aggressive Kindred decks, where you'd want to maximize efficient cards of the right type to fill out the slots in your deck. This was especially true for this Merfolk deck since it was built around opposition, an enchantment that lets you tap one of your untapped artifacts, creatures, or lands to tap an artifact, creature, or land an opponent controls. Merfolk of the Pearl Trident then becomes a 1-mana permanent you can tap to force your opponent to tap the most relevant thing on their board. And once you've already had the lock on board, your Lord of Atlantis would then buff Merfolk of the Pearl Trident and make it a more effective blocker. This is a key example of how context can really push a card from awful to potent game piece. A deck built around running as many Merfolk as possible, and to run as many cheap tappable permanents as possible, is the perfect home for a card that in any other deck is basically a waste of deck space. While by our standards of today, we have efficient creatures who get all sorts of upsides, at the time of its prominence, the efficiency really was the upside, and that upside was enough for this deck to take second place at Worlds and help shape the future Merfolk design for years to come. We'd even get a callback to Merfolk of the Pearl Trident in Master of the Pearl Trident, another powerful lord effect for the Merfolk creature type. Despite being a strategy devised in 2001, The opposition Merfolk deck operated on an axis more similar to modern Magic than most of its contemporaries, and elevated some pretty bad cards to playable status in the process. And finally, for number 1, we have Shuko. This equipment artifact costs 1 generic mana and gives the equipped creature +1 power and has an equip cost of 0. The most simple comparison for Shuko is Bone Splitter. It costs the same amount of mana and buffs slightly more in exchange for having an equip cost of 1. Bone Splitter has seen some success in Pauper and other bouts of play in the past, but these days is generally not seen as worth running. Most equipment offer way more than both of these two, with Shadow Spear feeling like it's from a whole different universe in terms of individual power as a card, despite having the same mana cost. However, Shuko is also the most recent card in this list to find success, suddenly going from unplayable bulk to a $20 in-demand card overnight, with the printing of 1 pesky bird in Modern Horizons 3. Nadu Winged Wisdom gives all creatures you control the following ability. Whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn. The exact wording here is important. Specifically, the fact that this ability triggers only twice each turn applies to each creature on the field, not to Nadu's ability itself. This means that every creature you control represents potentially up to 2 free cards if they get targeted. Shuko's equip cost of 0 means you can repeatedly target creatures to equip without running out of mana, as you add more and more cards to your hand. This isn't card draw either, meaning it gets around the likes of Orcish Bowmasters, and puts any lands you find into play untapped, meaning it provides you the mana to keep casting new creatures to target. Shuko only sees play because it's a repeatable instance of free targets on your turn, which means free Nadu triggers. This synergy makes it remarkably easy to draw through your entire deck and either win via Thassa's Oracle or by completing more convoluted loops that we don't have the time to explain here. Regardless, Nadu is one of the most egregiously broken cards printed in some time, completely overtaking the game and a massive pile of triggers that bury the opponent. Even if the opponent tries to disrupt the combo, that just leads to targeting more things, which gives the Nadu deck a chance to find a response. Recency bias is certainly a factor to some degree, but there's no denying how fast and intensely Shuko rose up. And once Nadu was eventually banned, Shuko faded right back into obscurity, no longer propped up by a card that finally breaks it.